All right, it is 3 o'clock, so we are going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. My name is Dr. Fatima Watt, and I'm a clinical psychologist and the director of behavioral health at Franciscan Children's. Thank you so much for joining me for part 2 of COVID-19 in our kids. Today we will be talking about grief in our children. We're going to talk about the stages of grief. There are varying models of grief, and many researchers have identified stages of grief. Some experts disagree with using stages because grief is such an individualized experience. Others have found it to be a helpful way to conceptualize and describe the grief process. Personally, while I do agree that individuals grieve in their own way, I find that the stages of grief are useful in that it allows the experiencer to label what they are feeling, and it can normalize the experience. This is the Kubler-Ross model of the stages of grief. I want to say it looks like this process could be linear in that you should be going through each of these stages in order, but that's absolutely not the case. Grief is transient and it's a fluid experiencing, meaning that people will fluctuate between the stages. You might move from anger to depression or from acceptance back to anger and so on. It is possible to skip stages, to move forward and then to move back. People who are able to cope well with their grief move in and out of the various stages. I'll talk about the stages in order, but I want to be clear that it's not a linear process for many people. And you might not be seeing a linear process as you're noticing signs of grief in your children. So the first reaction to loss is to deny the reality of the situation. This is what we call denial. People often think this isn't happening, this can't be happening. Denial is a common defense mechanism, and it can buffer the immediate shock of the loss, numbing us to our emotions. In this stage, we may feel that life is meaningless and nothing of value any longer. For most people experiencing grief, denial is a temporary response that carries us through the first wave of pain. In the denial stage, people may experience avoidance, confusion, elation, shock, or fear. Anger is the next stage of grief. In this stage, we may experience intense emotion, and the anger may be aimed at complete strangers, friends, family, or inanimate objects. You may be noticing if you are working with teens who at their baseline may be sort of irritable and moody, they may be using parents as a target for their anger at this point, and you may feel like you can't do anything right with your teenager. Don't worry, that is a common feeling for both the child and for both the teen and for the parent. In the case of death, anger may be directed at the person who has died. We may feel guilty for feeling angry, which can then make us feel even more angry. People may say to themselves, why is this happening? Who is to blame? Frustration, irritation, and anxiety may be experienced in people in this stage. Bargaining is the next stage. In this stage, people may say, make this not happen, and in return, I will, you can fill in the blank. Make COVID-19 go away, and I will wash my hands every 10 minutes. A normal reaction to feelings of helplessness and vulnerability is often a need to regain control through a series of if-only statements, such as, if only I had washed my hands more, or if only I had sought medical attention sooner. This is an attempt to bargain. Guilt often accompanies bargaining. We start to believe that there is something we could have done differently to change our circumstance. Feelings of being overwhelmed, helplessness, hostility, or flight may be experienced by people in this stage. The next stage is called depression. People in this stage may say, I'm too sad to do anything. In this stage, one may experience sadness, regret, despair, yearning, or deep loneliness. People in this stage may cry a lot or feel emotionally unstable. And the final stage is called acceptance. People in this stage may say, I am at peace with what has happened, or in this case of COVID-19, what is happening. This phase is marked by withdrawal and calm. But reaching this stage of grief does not happen for everyone. It is possible to become stuck in one of the earlier stages and to not reach acceptance. I want to be clear that acceptance is not equivalent to happiness. People in this stage explore options, they make new plans, and they move on. Okay, grief in children. While the stages of grief do not differ for children, the expression of grief in children is complicated by both internal and external content.
Mommy, it's not working.
I'm sorry, babe. You're going to have to do something else. The internal content is their age, stage of development, personality, and prior experiences. The external content is the nature of their relationship with the loss, how the loss occurred, whether expected or unexpected. And in the context of COVID-19, I think we can categorize most of our losses as being sudden and unexpected, and the types of support they have available and the response and responsiveness of their family system. Keep in mind that a child's reaction to grief will not appear the same as those in adults, and as a result, children are often misunderstood. They may appear disinterested or respond as if they don't understand the significance of what has happened, but even young children are aware of loss and death. They see it in cartoons, they see it in movies. Think about all the Disney movies we've seen where a character has a significant loss or someone in their life has died. However, children have a much more limited capacity for understanding loss, especially as it pertains to the death of a loved one. Children's intellectual development will have an impact on how they understand loss, express grief, and cope with their emotional experiences. To understand the cognition of children, I'm going to be using Piaget's stages of cognitive development as a reference. So I'm going to once again put up a graphic on my screen for you guys to follow along. Okay, I'm hoping that you guys can see that clearly. So the ages that you see in the table are averages, and children may show characteristics of more than one stage at a time. We'll talk about some of the common responses that you might see in children in response to grief due to their developmental level. According to Piaget, cognitive stages are not skipped, and each stage is marked by new intellectual abilities of a more complex understanding of the world. When considering how to support your child through grief, it'll be important to pair your supportive strategies with their developmental level rather than their age. So if you're working with a child, or if you have a child that has an intellectual disability or a developmental delay, they may require strategies designed for younger children rather than those for children of the same chronological age. So again, it's important that you're always making sure that you're pairing what you're doing to be supportive to your children with their developmental level. So let's start with the youngest, children under 2. Children under 2 are only aware of what is immediately in front of them. We call this the sensorimotor stage. They focus on what they see, what they're doing, and physical interactions with their immediate environment. Children in the sensorimotor stage do not recognize loss. However, they do sense the emotions around them, and they will miss a caretaker who is absent. If parents are stressed and overwhelmed, the child will see it. Children in this stage may experience withdrawal and irritability, and maintaining a routine and continuity of care is the best way to help them feel secure. Young children also benefit greatly from a lot of physical and emotional support. A lot of cuddling and physical contact can provide stability to children of the youngest age. In the preoperational stage, which is approximately toddlerhood through age 7, young children are able to think about things symbolically. Their language use becomes more mature. They also develop memory and imagination, which allows them to understand the difference between past and future and engage in make-believe. But their thinking is based on intuition, and it's still not completely logical. They can't yet grasp more complex concepts such as cause and effect, time, and comparison. Children in this stage have the ability to understand loss, thus they are able to engage in the grieving process. As noted by a famous children's psychologist, Alan Wolfelt, he said that anyone old enough to love is old enough to grieve, which I deeply agree with. However, young children are prone to magical thinking, as I mentioned earlier, where they believe that they did something to cause the loss. This can produce strong feelings of guilt. You might hear a little one say, "This is all my fault," which will come with associated upset. When I told my 6-year-old daughter that her school was closed, she responded, "Because I did not wash my hands enough times." And this is a perfect example of magical thinking. It's really important to address the magical thinking by providing factual information at a level they can understand. Answering questions in a calm and consistent manner is the most helpful. Children at this stage often will need to hear the same information over and over and over again, or as they are processing it. In response to the death of a loved one, it's important to use real words such as death and died, even at this young age. Using euphemisms like gone to sleep or passed away can be confusing because children understand that they wake up from sleep and that people who go away come back. And so using language that's confusing can actually heighten their anxiety. They may be afraid to go to sleep themselves because they're afraid they might not wake up. So it's really important to be clear with what you're talking about when you're having conversations with this young population. Even when they're told that someone has died, they may repeatedly ask where the loved one is, and even about when they're coming back. Be prepared to answer the same questions repeatedly, and be sure to address magical thinking each time it appears. The concrete operational stage is from approximately age 7 to 12. Children in this stage demonstrate logical, concrete reasoning. Children's thinking becomes less egocentric, meaning they're less focused on themselves, and they are increasingly aware of external events. They begin to realize that one's own thoughts and feelings are unique and may not be shared by others, or may not even be part of reality. Children at this age tend to be very curious about death and dying. They may also be preoccupied with things such as skeletons, ghosts, cemeteries. Children also in this stage tend to be very protective of the adults around them, and they may refrain from asking questions so that they don't upset their caregivers. So as an adult, as a caregiver, it's really important that you're as open as possible and even setting aside opportunities to talk, which can be really helpful for children in this stage. You may also see for this age group exaggerated behaviors in response to grief. Children in this developmental group may have tantrums in response to small upsets. They may have difficulty eating or sleeping. They may become more destructive or have aggressive behaviors towards themselves or others, or they may experience a regression in skills previously mastered. While all these things might be true at all of the stage levels, it's particularly true for this age group. I find that books and stories are really helpful for this age, and even children who are somewhat younger or somewhat older can really benefit from books and stories. Reading books about others who have experienced similar losses can really expand a child's ability to cope with their own grief. As clinicians, we call this bibliotherapy, but you do not have to be a professional or a therapist to use books to help your child understand and to cope with their loss. I do recommend, if you're going to use books, that you always read any books ahead of time before introducing them to your child, just to make sure that they align with your values. Adolescents, which can be as young as age 11, reach the fourth stage of development called the formal operational stage. Teens in this stage are able to logically use symbols related to abstract concepts such as algebra and science. They can think about multiple variables in systematic ways. They can formulate hypotheses, and they can consider possibilities. They also can ponder abstract relationships and concepts such as justice. Teens have an adult understanding of death, which means that they can understand that death is permanent, and they understand that all bodily functions cease. Teens, however, are at particular risk for what's called grief complicated by ambivalence. This means that they may pretend that they are not grieving in order to fit in with their peers. In this age group, you may also see some regression in functioning. The best way to support a grieving teen is really to be there for them. Talk openly and honestly. Listen. At this stage, it's really important to be able to listen to your teen, listen to their concerns and to their experience, and allow them to decide how they will cope, with the exception of self-destructive behaviors. Be available to walk with your adolescent through their grief while still honoring adultly responsibilities. It's going to be really important that you still draw limits, that you're providing guidance, and that you yourself are setting a good example for your teen. Okay, I'm going to try to rejoin the screen. And hopefully you guys were able to see that graphic okay. So as in every aspect of child development, chronological age is only one determinant of how a child changes over time. Personal and family experience with loss, grief and death, exposure to books, and other media and community events may all serve to move a child to a different stage of understanding. Similar to adults, children may express a range of emotions following a loss. They may express or experience feeling emptiness or sadness. They may experience relief, guilt, self-blame. They may have explosive emotions. There may be a sense of disorganization or panic. There may be regression, as I mentioned. They may experience some physiological changes, or they may have a complete lack of feelings. All of these responses are within the normal range of grief reactions. I also do want to mention that as children move through the cognitive stages, as they start to develop and gain maturity, it's possible for grief to reappear as they're adjusting in their new developmental stage. And this is because they have a greater understanding of what they've lost. And so you may see a reemergence of grief as a child leaves one stage of development and enters into a new stage of development. So I know that is a lot of information, and I see we have a question. Thank you so much for sending your question. What would be the best way to explain the grief graphic to young children? I don't want to scare them, but I want them to understand the grief process. This is an excellent question, and I think that when you are explaining grief to children, using graphics can be very helpful. The one that I showed on the screen is more geared towards adults, but there are many graphics available online where you can actually type in grief in children and look at the images, and there are some very child-friendly graphics that either use stick figures or child characters to display the grief process. So I love that you're thinking about using visuals that are at the correct developmental level. It's good that you're thinking, I don't want to scare the children, you don't want to provide them with too much information, but it is really helpful to use visuals, especially when trying to help them understand their own grief and to understand where they may be in the grief process. Thank you so much for that question. If there is any more questions, please feel free to send them along. So lastly, I'm going to provide a few general strategies for helping your child or teen through their grief during the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm also going to spend a little bit of time specifically talking about death and dying with your children, which I think is important, especially as the pandemic continues and more of us are being impacted by the loss of loved ones. So how do you do it? How do you help your child cope with feelings of grief and loss? The first recommendation that I have is really don't ignore your own grief. Children will often imitate the behaviors of their grieving caregivers. It's important that you show your emotions, as it reassures your child that feeling sad and upset during the COVID-19 pandemic is okay. However, reacting uncontrollably or explosively will teach your child unhealthy ways of managing their grief. So as I said before in our last YouTube video, our children are watching us, and so make sure that you are evaluating yourself and you're checking in on where you are in the grief process, and you may be grieving multiple things at once, and that you're managing and coping with your emotions, which is setting an example for your children. I see we have another question. Thank you so much. Do you have any examples of possible books or stories that can be used for bibliotherapy? What are examples of things you can say to adolescents during times of grief? These are really good questions. So I have a number of books that I really do like, but your choice of which book you choose for your child and your family is really going to be dependent on a number of factors, such as your cultural beliefs, your religious background, and what you value as a parent, which is why I recommended that you read any books that you might want to present to your child. You'll also want to consider, is your child grieving a general loss, such as the loss of their routines or structure, or is your child grieving the loss of a grandparent or a family member, or do they know someone else who has lost a grandparent or a family member? So in that case, there's a number of fabulous books. Freddie the Leaf is one of my favorites. It's a little bit more abstract, so you're going to want to use it for not kids as young as 4 or 5, but maybe 7, 8, 9, and it's about basically how leaves fall from the trees and their cycle, and it helps children understand the life cycle a little bit, and it can provide a lot of comfort. Other books that I like, The Invisible String is another one of my favorites. I Miss You is another book that is one of my favorites. I actually have a number of favorites, and so I can certainly put together a list of books based on developmental level and have that posted on one of our social media platforms to give you guys some access to that. And then what are examples of things to say to adolescents? I think the big goal with communicating with adolescents is really to listen and to say less, to make sure that they know that you're there for them, that you're ready to talk with them whenever they're ready. Some adolescents become very overwhelmed by their own emotional affect, and they're not really able to engage in conversation. And in that case, it's important to say, I know things are tough right now. I know our situation has changed, and be specific. I know you're not able to see your friends, and that's hard for you. I know doing schoolwork from home is really hard for you, and you don't have the supports that you're used to at school. I'm here and available if you want to talk about that anytime. And be prepared to listen. Let your adolescent take the lead. I hope that's helpful. Thank you for that question. Feel free to continue sending any if you have them. Continuing on with additional strategies, help your child label their feelings and name their losses. Name it and claim it. It's important that both you and your child acknowledge their pain. As a parent, you cannot protect your child from the pain of loss during COVID-19. Loss and grief are a part of our existence right now. But by allowing and encouraging your child to express their feelings, you're helping to build healthy coping skills, not just for now, but also for in the future when they may need them. Give your child permission to feel their feelings. Grief is a unique experience, and the way that they grieve is unique to them. Encourage your child not to feel embarrassed or to feel ashamed about how they're feeling, or over what they may be grieving for, whether they're grieving for a teacher or whether they're grieving for their best friend who they're not able to stay in contact with because of a lack of access or technology. Whatever it is, whatever, how big or how small, make sure that they're not feeling ashamed for the grief that they're feeling. This is going to be really important for adolescents as well, giving them that permission to say, yeah, this sucks right now. It's okay to feel sad. It's okay to feel angry. Giving them that permission can also give them permission to find healthy outlets to cope with that, with their emotional experience. Be careful not to minimize your child's grief experience. The best thing you can do is to allow your child to feel their grief when it comes to them. Resisting grief can prolong the natural healing process. This is also true for adults. I feel like, talking for myself, there's the resistance of wanting to think that this is how things are going to be for a little while. And that may be the case. And so recognizing my own grieving process and trying not to resist that, as that can lead to either one being stuck in a particular stage of grief or not being able to move forward towards acceptance. Young children express themselves through play, so provide lots of opportunities for creative and imaginative play, which can provide an outlet for self-expression. For older children, you can use drawing, music, poetry, writing, making puppets, whatever the case may be. Any way that you can find creative outlets for them is a good way to help manage and cope with grief. When guilt is expressed, it will be really important to validate that feeling. It's our instinct to say to others, don't feel guilty about that. That's not your fault. But that, in my experience, no one has ever felt less guilty because they were told not to feel that way. Instead, it's important to validate the feeling so that it can be processed and the individual can move on. Managing guilt in the context of grief is a giant topic in and of itself. So if you are finding that guilt has become a prominent feature of your own grief or is becoming a prominent feature of your child's grief, I would recommend reaching out to a counselor because guilt in and of itself can make grief complicated, which can prolong it, which can make someone vulnerable to depression. And so it's better to manage it as soon as possible rather than to allow that guilt to sort of fester and continue to be uncomfortable for your child or for you. I have another question. Are there ways to help youth cope with grief as a family? Aside from parents, are there other family members or important adult figures that young children could listen to? Absolutely. And that is also one of my recommendations, is for really helping your child to stay connected to loved ones and to people whom they feel that they have a connection with or whom they get comfort from. This might be a community leader, a pastor, or someone in your religious group. It might be an aunt or an uncle. It may not be the parent that the child gets the greatest amount of comfort from. And so I would absolutely say to reach out to other adult figures in your child's life. Make sure that your child's also staying connected to their own peers, especially adolescents. Isolation is a huge risk factor for adolescent depression. And so we want to make sure that especially adolescents during times of grief are staying connected with peers, with adults that they respect and that they get support and comfort from. And just as a family, I think it's really important to name how each of the members of the family are doing. Take time to talk about it as a family, to say, Mom, how are you feeling today? Dad, how are you feeling today? Aunt, uncle, grandma, whoever's in the house, to really be able to name your emotions as a family and to get a sense of where everyone in the family is, can really decrease that feeling of isolation and loneliness. And it really normalizes the experience. Oh my goodness, I'm not the only one that feels sad. I'm not the only one that feels angry. It gives permission. So I hope that answers your question. I see I have another question. Is there a timeline that parents should have? How long is too long for a child to be irreparably sad? This is a very good question. So grief has no timeline per se. However, a normal grief reaction is typically, I shouldn't even say normal because grief is so individualized. Often people grieve for about 6 to 12 months before they find healing and comfort and are able to move on. What I will say is that it's extremely important to know the difference between grief and depression. So if grief often will come in waves, whereas depression is much more pervasive and persistent. And so if you do have a child, if your child is just seeming very sad all the time, and you're not seeing the waves where they have lots of moments of happiness and joy and play and where they're engaging in developmental tasks, I would be concerned more for depression than for grief, and I would certainly seek professional services. It's also quite possible that even if someone is experiencing grief, that they may need professional services to kind of cope through that grief and manage the grief that they're experiencing, and that's okay too. So I wouldn't so much as put it on a timeline. I would measure the intensity of the experience. How much is this child able to function and do the things that they're supposed to do at their developmental level? Is it impacting their ability to complete routines during the day? Is it impacting their ability to socialize as much as we're able at this point? Those are things that I would be looking for in terms of deciding whether my child is having a pretty strong grief reaction that may need some professional support. I hope that answers your question. Thanks so much. If there's any more, please continue to send them through. Okay, stick to routines. Help children, both children and adults, really find great comfort in routines, predictability, and consistency. While it's important to take time to grieve, it's also important for your child to learn that life does go on. This is really hard to think about, the life going on, the moving forward in the context of coronavirus because there's so much unknown right now. But having routines, even in these unknown times, can be really grounding, and it can help us all to not feel stuck. And so again, back to the previous question about the timeline, it's less about the timeline and more about being able to kind of get through the day, even if they're experiencing waves of grief. That's totally okay if they're able to kind of function and get through developmental tasks as they're supposed to. And that they're able to experience joy and happiness for some moments throughout the day. Okay, next recommendation is to help your child take care of themselves physically. Bathing, eating, exercises, which can all be part of their daily routines. In addition to the emotional experience, grief can also cause physical symptoms such as insomnia, fatigue, nausea, aches and pains, and which all of that can lower your immunity. So by taking care of the physical self, we can minimize the impact of grief on our physical health. So let's talk a little bit about if your child or teen experiences the death of a family member or a loved one, because that may be the experience that some of us have already had, or that some of us will have, whether now in the current pandemic or in the future. So when you do talk to your child, it's important to be open and honest. You can stress points such as death is part of the life cycle. It's all right to cry and feel sad. It's okay to feel angry. It's all right to not want to talk to anyone for a while. Share with your children your religious, cultural, familial beliefs about what happens after death. For young children, and I'll kind of break down how much information by age a little bit. So for younger children, you don't want to provide too many details of the death, but you can say things like the body stopped working, or the body does not see, smell, pee, poop, or move anymore. You don't want to lie or try to hide the truth. Young children, toddlers, they will miss the presence of people who have died, and they will worry about the sadness they feel from the people that are around them. Lying to children or hiding the truth is going to increase anxiety. They are much better observers of adults than some of us give them credit for, and they are incredibly perceptive. For latency age children, 7, 8, 9, 10, offering additional information on what led to the death is appropriate and okay. For teens, you can take it even a step further and be prepared to answer the what now types of questions. In this age group, teenagers are able to recognize the impact on death that it may have on others that are still alive. And so be prepared to help them understand, what do we do now? When children are not given proper explanations, this is for children of any age, their powerful imaginations are going to fill in the blanks. They are picking up information from the people that are around them, but unfortunately, their imaginations often come up with things that are much worse than what the simple truth would have been. So it's much better to give them a clear idea of what's going on than to leave it up to their imaginations. Children need to know not only what happens to the body upon death, but they also need an explanation of what happens to the spirit or the soul based on the family's religious, spiritual, and cultural beliefs. It's really important to offer a detailed description of everything that they're likely to see and experience if they're going to participate in any rituals such as funerals. I would say that there's not an age that is too young to be able to participate in a funeral, but the caveat is that the child has to want to participate in the funeral or whatever ritual that there will be. It should never be forced. And there should be an identified adult that's going to support that child through the process. Children are very unpredictable, so even if you give your best effort and do all the preparation that you possibly can, their reaction during the event, during the ritual may be unexpected. And you should be prepared for that and be prepared for an adult to be able to remove them or to provide additional support or comfort if they're going to need it. If a child's not going to participate in a funeral, that's also okay. Children and adults can really come up with creative ways to memorialize the person who's passed. You can come up with personalized rituals or any other creative way that you can find comfort during the really sad times. So as I mentioned a little bit before, it's really important that as our children are going through the grieving process, as we're going through the grieving process ourselves, that we are recognizing the difference between grief and depression. And if you have concerns about your child's grief, if you're worried about depression, anxiety, or you're just unsure of how much you should be worried at all, I would highly recommend that you reach out to a professional counselor. Don't wait for symptoms to get worse. During this pandemic, it may take a little bit longer to access mental health services than usual. And so if you have any concerns at all, I would recommend to touch base with a counselor who can either say, yes, this is an appropriately normal grief reaction, and here are some strategies you can do to kind of help your child get through the process, or to say, I think your child is having a complicated grief. Let's work together in therapy. Or to say, I actually think this is a depressive disorder, and to treat it accordingly. If you're not sure how to access services, I recommend that you call your insurance company, or you can talk to your child's primary care physician for assistance. And my last recommendation is it is okay to be distracted and entertained during periods of grief. It's even okay to smile and laugh and to experience moments of happiness and joy. And in fact, I highly encourage it during this very stressful and unprecedented time. Take moments to laugh together, to meditate or use mindfulness to find moments of calm and peace. Even though these are somber times, it's okay to find joy in the human connections that we're still able to have. So I'm going to check for any last minute questions. Those are all of the points that I wanted to make today. So if you do have any last minute questions, feel free to send them along. You can also feel free to reach out to us on any of our social media platforms, Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook. I am so glad that you guys joined me this afternoon. I apologize for our technical difficulties early on, but they seem to have resolved, and I hope that this was helpful for you. Our next series or our next talk of COVID in our kids will be about post-traumatic stress disorder and acute stress disorder, which may be a reality for some of our children as the pandemic continues. So again, don't hesitate to reach out if you have more questions, and be well, everyone.